Howdy, all you delicious people. So I just started watching the Orville. I'm just like, you know what? I'm really just gonna go and just start watching this show and see what happens with the reviews. When looking at it, I realized that these were like 45-minute episodes. I'm like, oh crap! Like I didn't realize these episodes were that long. I guess I'll just kind of go in and just kind of like watch a couple of episodes and just see where the reviews go. If no one cares, then that's great. When looking at it, I've seen so many Star Trek shows. When looking at it, I even saw the Star Trek Below Decks or whatever, Lower Decks, whatever the stupid deck show is, because that show has a huge deck. That's always the joke I have to do whenever somebody puts the word deck into anything. So, going into this show, I immediately thought, you know what, this kind of feels like Galaxy Quest, but when all really looking at it, like it's a Galaxy Quest show that actually is much more like legitimate and feels like it kind of actually does feel like a Star Trek show. Like it does feel like a show that kind of makes jokes about things, but when looking at it, I just thought it was ultimately just fascinating how we have it to where like Captain Ed Mercer can't like break through a door, but we ultimately have seemingly another character called Lieutenant Laura Kitten, who ultimately can like bust through an entire wall, which I thought was hilarious. Um, we have her ultimately showcasing that this girl has like uber strength to be able to just, and I thought that was interesting. Going into this show, I thought that reasonably, I thought that this was going to be overly humorous to the point of it just, like, not making sense or whatever. Like, I think there is some funny portions of this show, but when looking at it, I think it's a real legitimate show. It's not like something where it's trying to be a parody of something. It's not trying to point out, horrible Star Trek logic or something along those lines. It's ultimately, to me, like, I think I can understand why a lot of people say that, yeah, I'm watching The Orville because I think it's a Star Trek show that I think that people really need right now. Or even Star Trek isn't really what people want for Star Trek anymore. To go into shows like Picard and just be kind of like, yeah, just really just it's basically really having it to where, hey, you remember this character? Do you remember this treasure trove of thing that ultimately we're going to bring into this show? It's just kind of an Easter egg kind of show, but it doesn't really have a legitimately good or solid story that anyone can really care about, sadly enough. So, because I had watched Picard, but ultimately I was like, dude, I'm not gonna review this. Like, ultimately, it's like I feel like I need to know every little thing about Star Trek, either Next Generation or everything about Star Trek to ultimately just be like solid and or sound about reviewing Picard. And then plus, I think everybody really just hated Picard anyways, so it ends up being what it is. Some people may have liked it. I don't know. So going into the Orville, so what is this show about? So reasonably, we have it where for every single beginning of every single Starship show, you really have to have the real true like introductions of a lot of people, and we really have to where in the very beginning of this we have to solidly kind of set up every little character that they're going to have in this show. We end up having it to where everybody has an importance, kind of like in Star Trek Next Generation, where we have like so many different people with on the ship, but everybody has their layer or level of importance. And that's the thing that I ultimately liked about this show was like it kind of gives me Star Trek Next Generation vibes, where it's like we're kind of going throughout the entire ship, and it's not all about what uh, it's not all about the bridge, so to speak. It's not all about the engineering. It's not all about whatever. It's basically just like, meh. How about we just do a show about uh, like one character on this ship, and then we'll just kind of do an entire episode about that. And they're like, okay, how about it? Like they're already taking the Star Trek Next Generation like later seasons, um, rather than just going at it and just going like, yeah, we need to have like battles and we need to have these odd approaches and everything like that. Like no. So going into this, I thought that the very first episode, the pilot, kind of was very much reminiscent on uh, of a Star Trek episode, but when also looking at it, they also it seems that at some point they try to like course correct some of the mistakes that a Star Trek show would tend to make, where ultimately it would be like, oh well, uh, if anything, we can just outsmart them instead of having to just give up. And so that's ultimately kind of the inventive thing that ultimately they take onto the show is realizing that like we're in space, we can do all kinds of things to ultimately just kind of throw a pipe in the wrench or ultimately just be inventive that no one else is doing. And I thought that that was rather interesting, the approach with which that they go on here. So ultimately, I think that's all that I really want to go in and talk about right now for this show, because it's really early. It's a lot of introductions of characters, and so ultimately, like I'm giving this show quite a bit of praise, but when looking at it, it's like I've only gone into 3 episodes. 3 episodes, which I thought, especially I think the third episode was really interesting, to just kind of break down the whole approach of forcibly changing a gender of somebody. I thought that I thought that that was really interesting. So moving on, let's ultimately go into that double five times territory because at the end of the day, there's maybe quite a bit to say about some of these episodes. There's a lot of technical stuff that I'm probably gonna have to try to, as much as humanly possible, skirt around really doing. Just because I don't want to the whole like tech aspect of everything, and ultimately there's gonna be a lot of times where I'm gonna go into Star Trek uh, ways of making it to where um, there's going to be some technical stuff that I'm just going to bashingly just say Star Trek terms for some of this stuff because that's probably what I ultimately have to do, just because I know Star Trek and so on and so forth. So when looking at it, if you're not a Star Trek fan and you don't understand the technical things that I ultimately say, like say for example, if I say like they put up their shields and they put somebody on screen or whatever, and they're yellow alerting themselves right now, and whatever. Like, there's a lot of Star Trek technical terms that ultimately you're elusive of. Then ultimately, I would just go into any Star Trek thing and figure out what any of these terms are. But I'm assuming that a lot of people that had seen this show probably see Star Trek. If not, then I'll probably have to figure out a common word to eventually go into this. But yeah. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I can spoil this show. So ultimately, the first real episode is to really just introduce us to all the characters. We end up finding out that it seems that ultimately Captain Ed Mercer, so Mercer's character, we end up finding out that seemingly Mercer was never home. And so ultimately we end up having it to where Kelly Grayson, which was ultimately his wife at a time where ultimately they were going to get married, ultimately we find out that Kelly was thrusted in the arms of another man because Mercer was never home. So we end up having Mercer ending up leaving Kelly to go off on his own. So we end up having it to where seemingly there is a Admiral Halsey that is going to give Mercer his own ship. It seems that ultimately, bizarrely, we are giving Mercer his own ship, but he seems like a person that is on the edge of why the F are you giving him his own ship? Supposedly he had been drunk 6 times, or he has shown up to work 6 times drunk to work. And ultimately they thought, like, yeah, let's give him a ship after that. It's kind of bizarre to me. Um, but I think reasonably we have it to where Kelly Grayson had done a little number to ultimately help Mercer ultimately get the ship that he's going to get. So we end up having it to where Mercer ends up going and starting to already know certain people that he's going to call upon to eventually be part of his ship. We end up having Gordon Malley, or Lieutenant Gordon Malley. We end up having seemingly Mercer ending up going through seemingly a lot of his rooster or his roster to ultimately go through and mention a lot of the seemingly random-ish like people that are ultimately being put into this roster of Mercer superiors. We end up finding Dr. Claire Finn, which I thought was a really funny introduction to this character, which ultimately I know her from the show Castle, and a number of things also. We end up having it to where Dr. Claire is ultimately talking to Mercer and basically mentioning that, like, if you're not fit for active duty, she'll let him know, kind of thing. I thought that this is like the most interesting introduction to a doctor on a show. I thought it was like, man, like, we have it to where Dr. Claire Finn is ultimately kind of, in a lot of terms, she's kind of the, God, what is the right word? She's a medical doctor, but in also a lot of ways, she's kind of the, I guess I would say, like, she's also kind of the person that is almost the therapist of a lot of people. I mean, like, she's a medical doctor, but also she's if she's there to put people in their places, but then also she's there to kind of guide some people. So she's kind of like, uh, in the Star Trek Next Generation terms, she's kind of like Deanna Troi, or ultimately she's kind of like, I guess, Whoopi Goldberg's character, kind of like uh, she's a very interesting character, and I really like. I'm kind of waiting for them to use her more, because ultimately, when seeing Dr. Claire Finn in the episode where ultimately she is guiding one of the people who is trying to take charge, I thought that episode was really interesting. So ultimately, I can't wait for her to be used more. So, but we'll talk about that episode later. So ultimately, we have Mercer, who is going through and ultimately finding that ultimately we have a Lieutenant Commander Bortus, who ultimately seems to, in a lot of terms, in a lot of ways, looks like the guy from, if you take a picture from the guy from Galaxy Quest, who ultimately is my grandma's hammer, ultimately the guy who played Severus Snape on the Harry Potter movies. If you take his image and then you take Bortus and you put them side by side, they look like the same character basically, with the exclusion of Bortus having way more makeup than the other guy does. So, and plus also he's basically the Worf of this show, but hilariously enough, he's the Worf of this show, but he is not actually like a security guard of sorts. We end up having it instead to where ultimately Laura Kidda is ultimately the security guard of sorts. We ultimately have it to where it seems that people are drastically underestimating her, and ultimately it's like, why is she the security guard? But then eventually we realize how ridiculously strong she is, and then ultimately everybody's like, oh, okay, all right. So we end up having it to where reasonably, so Mercer ends up seemingly getting to know all of his acquisitions that are ultimately going to be his people that are on his bridge. We ultimately at some point have it to where we have Isaac, who seems to be a character that is otherwise a robotic character that seems much more superior than everyone else. And so I thought that it was really interesting how we have like technically a data, if you want to say so, from Star Trek, where we have like an android within this show. Because looking at it, I'm like, oh, okay, so are they gonna have a technical person? Are they gonna have like a Geordie? Or are they gonna have like a robotic being of sorts? And ultimately, they go into here and they have that. So I thought that it was really interesting. So we go on. So we end up having it to where Mercer ends up going and finding out that it seems that Kelly Grayson is ultimately going to be his number one or second in command. We ultimately find out that ultimately Mercer ends up wanting to, as soon as Kelly ends up arriving, we end up having it to where Mercer ends up having a thing of dialogue with her, ultimately having it to where Mercer had supposedly moved on, but when looking at it, there's only 6 times before this that ultimately would probably prove otherwise. So we end up having it to where Mercer and Kelly are talking, and we end up having it to where Kelly just kind of does small talk where ultimately she talks about Mercer's office, how she really likes it, and we end up having Mercer going, "Oh, well, hey, well, that's great. Well, I'll be able to get people to give you specs about every single little thing. So ultimately, you'll be uh, completely happy with being able to get the specs of my office, so you can go and use that for your new apartment that you're gonna get, your new room." So we end up having it to where Mercer is consistently throwing shade about the fact that ultimately uh, Kelly had dumped. Kelly had basically dumped Mercer, or Mercer had kind of dumped Kelly after the fact that ultimately she was in the arms of another man. We ultimately have it to where Kelly is ultimately trying to take this position. She had fought for this position to ultimately be a way of making amends to Mercer, and ultimately we have it to where Kelly is otherwise seemingly having another motive, which again I'll tell you why later because you probably already figured it out. So we end up having it. So in this very first episode, we end up having it to where reasonably Mercer is going like, well, I think I'm gonna go and want to find another second in command, and Kelly is just like, well, that's perfectly fine. If anything, like I will be on the ship until eventually you can find someone to replace me, and then I will leave. So we end up having it to where Mercer's order is to go and give these supplies to an otherwise uh, planet. So recently, it's basically just like the first episode of Lower Decks, where we end up having it to where ultimately the ship is to send some supplies over to some planet, and then ultimately we end up finding out that there is much more going on that is led led to believe. So we end up having it to where ultimately there's an away team that ends up going down onto the planet because they are very confused about what is going on, because ultimately when they say, hey, we have your supplies for you, ultimately the people on the planet are saying, oh, no, no, we don't need any supplies, like we're fine. And ultimately, like, Mercer's like, huh, this makes no sense. So we end up having it to where I guess there is an enemy afoot upon this planet. I don't remember exactly what the enemy of this is, because when looking at it, there's several times, there's so many different aliens, there's so many enemies and whatever, you can kind of get confused about what is who and who is what in these episodes. So we end up having it to where reasonably we have that when the away team goes down to the planet, we end up finding out that it seems that these people at this planet have been able to uh, change the rotation of life. Reasonably meaning that they can make 100-year-old banana, or they could make a much older banana, and that repetitiously that's what they want to do, is just make things a lot older than they should be. And so the otherwise realize the eventually military applications that could ultimately go into this ray, or this device that otherwise these people of the planet have. Where ultimately it's like, well, hey, like if you have an enemy, then ultimately you can make your enemy much older to the point of just killing them over. So we end up having it to where reasonably so there seems to be an enemy ship that is to otherwise want to get this device. We ultimately seemingly have one guy on this planet ultimately to uh, take control over and hold hostage over the people on the planet. And so we eventually have it to where reasonably the enemy ship ends up going and and trying to get this device, and ultimately have it to where Mercer and the people on this ship ends up going and taking the device for themselves. So we end up having it to where ultimately, to avoid fighting, we end up having it to where Kelly and Mercer are trying to figure out how to take down this ship and how to figure out how to beat it. So we end up having it to where Kelly ends up figuring out in her head how quickly they can grow a plant. So we end up having it to where ultimately they end up going and putting basically a bomb through this device. So they end up teleporting the device to the enemy ship, and then a ton of freaking trees end up growing upon this ship to ultimately end up having this ship just basically just explode. After all this, we end up having it to where ultimately Mercer ends up telling a joke about like Happy Nation Day or National Day, or Happy like Tree Day or whatever. We end up having it to where ultimately nobody, I guess, realizes that like what that actual day is. What is he talking about? And ultimately we have it to where it's like, well, that holiday is to talk about like trees. It's ultimately growing trees, and so ultimately that was his one liner. And we end up having it to where Kelly ends up thinking of a better one liner, like, you could have just told him, like, hey, got wood? And then everybody starts laughing bizarrely. So we end up having it to where Mercer's like, well, I guess that's not as good as got wood, I guess. Whatever. So we end up having it to where there is supposedly another good second in command that ultimately Kelly is fine with just resigning and leaving the ship. And Mercer says, you know what, you're smarter than me, and I think I need you on the ship. So we seemingly have it to where Kelly is to go to this admiral, and the admiral is basically to mention that ultimately Kelly had put together Mercer being on the ship, and we ended up having Kelly, who had fought for Mercer to be on the ship, and then ultimately it's good that ultimately Kelly had been able to be his second in command, because she probably could have gotten captain of the ship. So that's the first episode. We have it to where the second episode ends up going along and having it be that seemingly, I think that this episode was really designed quite possibly to maybe have like maybe Seth MacFarlane maybe direct this episode, or maybe have Seth MacFarlane in this episode a little bit less. Like, I think some of these episodes are maybe possibly trying to design to ultimately have it to where Seth MacFarlane isn't as much on this show, so ultimately he can go and do some stuff with Family Guy or whatever other things that he has going on right now. So we end up having it to where ultimately Mercer. So we have it in the second episode that it seems that Mercer and Kelly end up going off into going and being on a away ship, and so they end up going on an away ship, and then that ends up having them being sucked into seemingly some uh, part of space that ultimately it seems that the ship cannot go to. It seems like a war zone. So ultimately we have it to where ultimately they cannot go there. So we end up having it to where Mercer and Kelly are off, and we find out that ultimately we have Laura Kitten, who ultimately is the very much like I would call her almost like a Klingon looking character, which ultimately she has like kind of little divs in her little divs in her forehead. It kind of looks like Worf, but it's not exactly like Worf. So we end up having it to where this entire episode is to have it to where this girl is like she's strong, but when looking at it, she is not like she's strong on the outside, but she's not strong on the inside. Like if ultimately her taking command will drive her to drink, or I don't know what that species does with alcohol, but it seems like she just tosses it back like nobody's business. So we have it to where there's ascension in the ranks, to where ultimately we have it to where Laura Kitten ends up going to the Admiral, and the Admiral tells her that, like, basically that Mercer and Kelly are to basically be called as missing in action, and for ultimately Laura or Alora to go back and seemingly go and find a new captain and a new first uh, number one, so to speak. We end up having to where Allura ultimately is going to use all of the reserve power to try and search for Mercer and Kelly, and that's what ends up finding them into some neutral zone where they cannot go further, or otherwise they will start a war. So we end up having it to where Laura ends up going and saying, you know what, damn all of this. I'm gonna go and get our captain and our first and Kelly. We're gonna get Mercer and Kelly. So we ultimately end up having it to where ultimately because people were like, well, if you would have been lost, like our captain would have done anything humanly possible to go and find you. And so ultimately, Catan ultimately goes and says, like, well, F it. Like, that's what I'm going to do. So we end up having it to where ultimately Kitten is ultimately telling ultimately Gordon Malley and John Lamar ultimately it's like, hey, like we need to as quickly as humanly possible fly to this planet where ultimately these people are at, cloak ourselves as a different ship, and we have it to ultimately Kitten is ultimately going with Isaac the robot because ultimately they will respect his intelligence. So we end up having it to where Kitten and Isaac ends up going in and trying to basically buy back Mercer and Kelly. So because we end up having it to where uh, Kelly and Mercer are immersed seemingly back into their old quarters uh, before they had broken up, kind of thing. So if anything, it's kind of a reminder of them breaking up. And so ultimately, they had Mercer and Kelly had some pretty good times of backstory where they were kind of telling us about old times, about certain couples that they had been coupled with that didn't work out. We ultimately find out that Mercer didn't really like opera and all kinds of things. and we ultimately find out that seemingly that uh, Mercer likes to just drink a lot, like especially in the mornings, because evidently in Germany it reminds him of Germany. So we end up having it to her reasonably. So going on into here, we have it to where it seems like they go and make and strike a bargain. So we end up having it to where Kitten and Isaac end up buying Mercer uh, and Kelly back for what is to be showcased uh, for this for the thing to fill the spot for Mercer and Kelly. It's all episodes of reality TV, basically showcasing the worst of reality TV shows, I guess, to be deemed by probably Seth MacFarlane. So we end up having like bizarrely everyone is going to this spot where ultimately Mercer and Kelly were told me see like Real Housewives and Duck Dynasties and all kinds of other things and Jersey Shores and all kinds of other things. Which ultimately everybody's like, oh my god, this is like the best showcase that we've ever had, kind of thing, and everybody's high fiving and kind of thing, and everybody's like excited about this new showcase that is going to show the worst of Earth, basically. So, which is basically just TV. So we end up pushing on. So ultimately, the last episode is to have it to where ultimately Lieutenant Commander Bortus and his husband is ultimately going to hatch an egg. So we end up having it to where that is the reason why Commander Bortus ultimately had been away and Alora had to go and take command because Bortus ultimately had to go away to ultimately hatch his egg. A lot of times when Laura was making kind of harsh decisions and stuff along those lines, we end up having Bortus end up calling and saying like, "Hey, like, what's going on?" Ultimately, like, "Hey, I'm trying to hatch an egg here, and like, you guys are just kind of doing all kinds of weird stuff." So we end up having it to a reasonably so. Bortus ends up hatching a female, and ultimately that is a unicorn-esque like thing of his species. So we have to have an entire episode dedicated to this child, ultimately having it to where Bortus and his husband are ultimately demanding that this child get a gender change, let's just say. Um, because ultimately it seems that their society had been all males. So we end up having it to where Bortus ends up demanding that ultimately uh, the doctor ends up changing the gender of his baby, and the doctor of this ship ends up refusing. So we end up having Bortus end up going and demanding to speak to Mercer, and Mercer ends up getting involved in this, and we end up having it to where Mercer ends up deciding it's like, dude, I'm not gonna forcibly change the gender of this child. Like, there's no way. Like, I don't care that ultimately you have an entire society that is all male. I don't care. So we end up having it to where reasonably. So Bortus ends up going in here and calling his own ship to ultimately bring a ship to him, so that way ultimately he can go and find uh, a doctor of his species, so they will do the change. So we end up having it to where ultimately one of these guys from Brodus's species ends up coming onto the ship, and ultimately we have this debacle about like female and male or whatever. That ultimately it seems that it comes down to that it's a ailment that ultimately needs to be corrected of some sorts. That basically, like Kelly puts it in a very interesting way, that ultimately she has the case of the tits kind of, and so recently they need to like absolve that kind of thing, and I thought that that was kind of funny. So we end up having it to where ultimately this case is to go on trial. So we end up having it to where Kelly supposedly has to go and go on trial to ultimately resolve all this because Boris ends up changing his mind about the gender of his child because he eventually sees Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and he realizes that ultimately maybe his child could have a real uh, beneficial reason for being the gender that the child is. So, but we end up finding out that ultimately it seems that Boris, ultimately his husband, was, I guess, originally a female as well, that eventually was changed to be male. So we end up having it to where Boris's husband ultimately wants to have it be changed because ultimately, uh, like he felt like an outcast, and so ultimately he didn't want his daughter to feel like an outcast, maybe like the band Outcast. So we end up having it to where they do this trial, and so ultimately we have it to where it seems that Boris ultimately had given a quote of some author that ultimately everybody reads within his planet, and so ultimately we end up finding out that Mercer ends up trying and scanning to find any female uh, people left onto this planet. And so we end up having it to where Mercer ends up going to the caves to find out that there is a woman within this planet that ultimately is of this species. And so ultimately we have it to where we find out that this woman is also a author that is basically an author that everyone reads on this planet, and they've never known until now that ultimately it was a woman writing all of this. So we end up having it to where ultimately the child still goes and gets a gender change regardless, and ultimately it was like, to me, I thought that this show was really good. I thought that this episode was really good. I thought it was really interesting. Kind of how they kind of broke everything down, where ultimately we have it to where like Kelly had tried to have one of Brodus's species ultimately try and like break down this cube, and ultimately he couldn't. But then we have it to where Kelly gave this same brick to Kidda or Kitten, who ultimately is uber strong, and she breaks it down into a circular ball, and we end up having Kelly ultimately mentioning like, well, hey, like this girl who is not as strong as a man is, um, or is a woman, and she could break this down, and ultimately we have it to where there is so many back and forth things that ultimately they kind of summed everything up as. Like we basically had it to where ultimately like Boris's species, the attorney on their side, end up going and talking about like having somebody who gets a bris from being Jewish, ultimately having their downtown being changed of sorts for the wanting of their parents. Why isn't that the exact same thing as going and getting a change of sorts of gender? And so ultimately have it to where reasonably that is the consensus of like having a bris is basically just as almost the same thing as changing a gender. So we end up having it to where Bortus ultimately gets his child changing of gender, and so ultimately we have it to where like that resolves the whole entire episode. And I thought these episodes were really interesting, but at the end of the day, that's all I wanted to say about these episodes. So I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.